From honor killings to forced marriages, the control and punishment of women's behavior is often justified in the Muslim world by male clerics who claim these practices are Islamic. I'm going in search of women who have gone back to the Holy Quran as the core of the faith, using it to fight back against tribal and patriarchal oppression. And it's their challenge that could transform the future of Islam. If many in the West see Islam as backward, one reason is the practice known as female circumcision or genital mutilation, excising the clitoris of young girls. In Egypt, it's thought 97% of married women have been mutilated in this way. Although now illegal, a recent feature film made headlines for showing what still goes on. Based on a true story, the film is about a schoolgirl who gets pregnant and gives birth alone. When taken to hospital, a Muslim surgeon decides to treat the girl for her promiscuity by illegally removing her clitoris.
استنى محمود.
This cruelty is regularly defended by Muslim clerics, who often say it's Islamic. I spoke to one conservative sheikh, Dr. Abdul Sabur Shaheen. He was full of enthusiasm for the practice.
أولاً الخفاض هو نوع من تكريم البنت بدلاً من أن تكون مشوهة. ختان المرأة إنما يكون عندما
Circumcision is an act of compassion towards the woman. It's a way of honoring her, rather than disfiguring her. It is necessary when the woman has a long clitoris. That is why it is reduced. Reduction helps because the long clitoris is a discomfort to the woman when she is walking in the street. So it is the norm to reduce the organ proportionately, rather than eliminate it entirely.
But just a few minutes later, Dr. Shaheen changed tack to say that it was really all about sex.
It prevails in rural communities because of the need to protect the girl. If it stays long, she is in a state of extreme sexual excitement. No one can deny this. So it is done to stop the girl from being wayward. After that, she can get married and satisfy her sexual desires legitimately, in a proper Islamic way.
Dr. Shaheen is only one of several Muslim scholars who justify the practice of what they call female circumcision, actually an African tradition found throughout the Nile Valley.
أنا عملت اللي مليه عليا ضميري كطبيب مسلم.
ازاي يعني؟ وفين موافقة أهل المريض؟
يلا ما جابتش 16 سنة، قليلة الرباية، حامل وبتولد. ويمكن اللي عملته ده يساعدها تتحكم في نفسها شوية. الطهارة مهمة يا دكتور، حتى طبيا.
The director of this film, Magdi Ali, based the story on his own experiences working in a hospital as a pharmacologist.
I try, for example, for this circumcision to say that it's not Islamic. But they don't believe me. In the film, if you notice, the woman says that the Prophet never makes circumcision to his daughters. So this is a marvelous proof that it's not Islamic.
What this is really all about is the conflict over age-old traditions in a culture where, especially outside the big city, men are used to controlling women. It may not look like much, but this busy women's clinic in Cairo is a front line in that fight. Dr. Mawahib El-Moueli's patients are from poor, rural, and mostly very strict Islamic families. And she tells them that there's nothing in Islam to justify female genital mutilation.
Female circumcision has nothing to do with religion. It's been there for ages and ages, even pre-Islamic, even pre-Christianity. And our Christians as well as Muslims do it. In many cases, tradition is mistaken for religion. Islam has some instructions, of course, for women. But unfortunately, religious leaders tend to control women by not revealing the whole facts about Quran. But the good thing is that women's attitude towards circumcising their daughters is changing.
In 1997, the Egyptian government made female genital mutilation illegal, but it continues to be carried out in backstreet surgeries and even middle-class private clinics.
One of the biggest problems for me has been discovering how much that seems to be negative in practice doesn't have any source in the Quran. It's all from the hadiths, it's the sayings ascribed to the Prophet that were written down many years after his death. And even scholars agree there are some which are more questionable than others. One of the issues which is never mentioned in the Quran is the idea of a female genital mutilation. But there is one hadith which has a reference to a woman who apparently carried out such practices coming to the Prophet and asking him about it. And he is supposed to have said, if you must cut, then cut gently or cut lightly, because it is more pleasing for the man. Now, some have said, well, it means that you are allowed to cut, even if the Prophet isn't actively encouraging it. But there is no reference to it in the Quran, and there's certainly no idea that it's advocated. And yet in places like Egypt, it is still normal for nearly all Muslim women, and it's considered appropriate and part of their modesty.
If female genital mutilation is slowly on the retreat in Egypt, it is because women are challenging the old traditions using the religious texts themselves. Cairo's Al-Azhar University and Mosque is considered to be the highest seat of learning for Islamic scholars, the world authority on Quranic interpretation. At the women's faculty, I found young, confident Muslims taking an active part in the debate about the future of their religion, unlike their mothers who were excluded from religious study.
They study literature in Arabic, medicine, but they didn't study religion. Prophet Muhammad say, "Al-Islam mu'amala," which means Islam is how to deal with people. That's what we are learning.
In fact, that's the one thing that I think we should be basically concerned with. It's correcting the image of the highly disfigured image of women abroad.
These young women reject Western values, but they also reject many of the practices which they and their mothers were brought up to believe were Islamic, seeing them now as just the result of a culture in which men policed female behavior.
If we started this talking and this conversation with foreigners, I think we could have prevented many bad things to happen.
Women in Islam are being educated. They get a chance at building a highly reputable career. They earn their own money, and they have their own standing and their own position on difference of worldwide problems. So why think of them as less in any way from women all over the world? And I think that's our mission, mainly to simply show the true face of Islam.
I mean, say in Saudi Arabia, women cannot drive a car or cannot vote. That's what they say is Islamic, but that's not true here. I just wondered if you have an opinion about that.
Everything in Islam is allowed, unless this thing is forbidden by a verse or by a perfect hadith. Everything is allowed, unless these things are circled by kind of rules. If I am kept inside this circle, so I can do whatever I like.
These students at Al-Azhar are genuinely committed, and they know their holy text in detail. I imagine they'd have no trouble holding their ground against male fundamentalists. I don't know if they'd call it feminism, but that's what it looks like to me. There is a new generation of Islamic scholars who are happy to call themselves both feminists and fundamentalists because they return to the original text of the Quran to regain for women the status they enjoyed in early Islam. Dr. Zainab Radwan specializes in Sharia Islamic law.
القرآن كل لفظ فيه ليه معنى. لو ما فيش أي نص مطلقا في القرآن في واقع من الواقع
If there is no specific instruction about something in the Quran, you have the right to apply your own knowledge in order to put it in context and arrive at whatever interpretation is of greatest benefit to the community. The aims of the Sharia are to relieve hardship and to enable people to enjoy life within the boundaries of whatever is in the best public interest. It may be that stricter practitioners wouldn't agree with my interpretation. They would argue that a literal reading is the only way forward for the survival of Islam in our society today. Well, I don't agree with that strict stance. In every Islamic society, there are liberals and conservatives.
The concept of chastity has all but disappeared in the West, but it's fundamental to Islam. Sex outside marriage is forbidden for men too, but in practice it's women who carry the burden of maintaining their honour. Young couples try to get round this by using the concept of urfi, unregistered marriage. It means secret, and it's hugely controversial in Islam, because marriage is supposed to be public. In urfi, a couple agree to be married in secret, giving them a kind of indulgence to have sex without, they believe, offending Allah.
The Urfi marriage is very common among the Egyptian youth. And of course, I think that it's good, and it's not really haram. It's not forbidden, really. And I think it's the only way the youth can respect themselves, because they think that this is good with Allah, and at the same time they fulfill that kind of desire they can't stand. Do you think that youth is going to wait until 35 or 40 years of old just to start their living?
We met couples who'd entered into an urfi marriage, many of them students falling in love for the first time, but none of them would go on camera to talk about it. In the West, premarital sex is no longer taboo, but from the stories I was hearing, when urfi marriages break down, the boy often denies they were ever married, and the girl is left with her reputation in tatters. So what does the Quran actually say about the idea of an unregistered marriage?
There's a verse in Surah 24, verse 33. Let those who find not the wherewithal for marriage keep themselves chaste until God gives them means out of his grace. Which, small few lines, but seems to be saying, if you can't afford a dowry for a proper marriage, you have to wait until you can.
The Quran seems pretty clear on that one. So what do young Muslims think? In one of the more sophisticated parts of Cairo, I came across a familiar-looking cafe, a theme bar based around the Friends TV series. This stylish group lounging around inside was surely in favour of loose urfi-style relationships. Not at all. While clearly at ease in Western culture, their loyalty to Islam is uncompromising.
You hear about this trend in Egypt, which is urfi marriage. I didn't know if you had come across that at all at university.
Not accepted very much.
It's not accepted at all.
Because in Islam also you have to celebrate the wedding publicly.
It's not approved, it's not marriage for us.
I mean, you're probably aware, there are moves to get urfi marriage recognised so that women who go into one have the right to divorce.
I don't think it's good for them to legalize it, because it's wrong. So they do it very early. They do it when they're in college. They do it when they have no income. If she gets pregnant, in most cases the guy quits.
The problem is for the girl, not for the boy, because her rights are totally destroyed with this urfi marriage.
Parents don't allow that, they don't want them to marry a certain guy, so they just go do this urfi marriage instead of because they don't get the approval of their parents.
I mean, you obviously don't think urfi marriage is a solution. What is the answer then for young people like that, whose families don't want them to do what they're doing?
They just don't do it.
Just don't do it.
Just wait.
I think they can have a relationship, a normal relationship, without marriage. like a boyfriend-girlfriend thing.
But when you say, in the West, you're probably aware, people have, they have a sexual relationship before marriage and there is no stigma about it. Is that what you mean?
No.
Sex here is not allowed in religion or tradition. So the relationship she means is kind of friendship.
Islam has a poor image in the West when it comes to marriage. Stories of arranged or forced marriages and polygamy abound. But as I was about to find out, when you go back to its roots, it's very firm in its advocacy of women's rights. This is Karachi, Pakistan's most vibrant city. There's a special buzz about it now because it's wedding season, and I'm here to attend one. My father grew up here, and going to big family weddings was how I spent many of my school holidays. The bride-to-be, Nadia, is at the beauty parlour, putting the finishing touches to her wedding preparations. Nadia is a Sunni Muslim, while her fiancé, Hussein, comes from a more religious Shia family. I wondered what difference that would make to the wedding ceremony.
There are lots of things. Some of them are like little things, like once we get married, go back to his parents and he has to wash the woman's feet and stuff like that. So little things like they've asked us, okay, so what customs do you have? And they don't have a problem with us and we don't have a problem with
You
theirs.
don't have a problem with your husband washing your feet?
No. I think it'll be fun actually washing.
You hear a good deal about arranged marriages in Pakistan. I wondered how she and Hussein got together.
We've practically grown up with each other. We were in the same school for like 15 years, but we didn't really know each other. It was only until we went to college. He was in Boston, I was in Chicago, and that's where we met, in Boston.
But in Pakistan, arranged, sometimes forced marriages are still the norm in the poorer, rural parts of the country, as families try to keep control of women's property rights, which are passed on through marriage. Again, it's local custom and culture at work. And on this issue, the Quran is very clear.
There is no concept of forced marriage in the Quran, indeed of arranged marriage. It's always assumed that the woman and the man are both giving full consent. She owns her own property and she has her own rights, which have to be respected. O ye who believe, ye are forbidden to inherit women against their will, nor should ye treat them with harshness, that ye may take away part of the dower you have given them, except where they have been guilty of open lewdness. On the contrary, live with them on a footing of kindness and equity.
And amongst the wealthier classes, love marriages, like this one of Hussein and Nadia, are what most young people would aspire to.
And later in the Quran, in Surah 30, which deals in more spiritual terms with the creations of God, one of the verses is specifically about the amazing creation of marriage and of men and women for each other. And among his signs is this, that he created for you mates from among yourselves, that ye may dwell in tranquility with them. And he has put love and mercy between your hearts. Verily in that are signs for those who reflect.
The evening before Nadia and Hussein's big day, the couple's families put on a big and brash party called a Mehndi. It's a kind of hypercharged shower party for the bride and groom, and a great opportunity for everyone to let loose on the dance floor.
At first glance, there's nothing particularly Islamic about this wedding. The cultural traditions, the flowers, the fruits and offerings, the ceremonies, the dancing, the henna, it's all Indian. Hindu, Sikh, it could be any of these things. And then you look closer, you see the women in hijabs who are not dancing, who are dressing differently. They don't have a problem with the fact that many other women are wearing incredibly slinky outfits, saris and makeup and so on. The whole scene here is completely at odds with that stereotype that I think now exists in the West of Pakistan as a country that's being sucked into Islamic extremism.
Next morning, before Nadia and Hussein's wedding gets underway, I head to the shore where Karachi faces the Arabian Sea. A steady stream of pilgrims are paying their respects at the shrine of a Muslim saint, Abdullah Shah Ghazi, one of the many wandering mystics who spread Islam through the region. The fragrance of the incense and the flowers reminds me of Hindu temples, but of Catholicism too, for these people are praying not to the saint, but through the saint to Allah, prayers of intercession.
Baba, for God's sake, you pray to the God for his son. I want his son only. Whatever you like, he will pray to God and God will give you. Then when your wish is completed or it is finished, then you come bring a chadar or rice.
You didn't bring sweets, you got agarbatti.
Why? Sweets are necessary.
I see.
It's assumed that you pray for a son, not a daughter. Islam doesn't seem to have overcome Asian culture that values the male over the female, even though the Quran condemned the devaluing of girls as barbaric. And yet here are Nadia and Hussein, about to tie the knot in a ceremony which places the greatest importance on the woman's genuine consent. The imam, the father and the witnesses have drawn up the wedding contract. The bride, still inside the house, should feel no pressure to go ahead if she's reluctant. She will be asked privately 3 times if she accepts the marriage. In contrast, the man's acceptance of the rite of marriage, intoned by the mullah, is very public, a declaration to his family and friends that he's taken on the responsibilities of a husband. Nadia has accepted the marriage and now joins her new husband. As Muslims, Hussein and Nadia are required by the Quran to live lives based on kindness and equity. And they start life together on the basis of a contract that specifies a woman's material rights in the marriage, something prescribed by Islam more than 1,000 years before it was heard of in the West. It remains an integral part of the institution of marriage, and not just for wealthy couples like Nadia and Hussein. Even a couple getting married against the wishes of their parents will sign a pre-marriage contract, in this case, Pakistani style.
आपका नाम क्या है? अरशाद हाजिर। कितना चाहिए आपको? 2 लाख? नहीं 400। नहीं। कितना काफी? लाख रुपए का।
हकमान 1 लाख रुपया इन दल तलब ये जमाने ने जदों तो मंगन गए ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ देना पएगा ਇਹਨਾਂ ਗਵਾਹਾਂ ਦੇ रूबरू ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ मंजूर है जी अच्छा जी अच्छा बेटा ਹੁਣ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਦੱਸੋ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਆਪਣੀ ਮਰਜ਼ੀ ਨਾਲ ਨਿਕਾਹ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹੋ ਨਾ ਜੀ ਜ਼ਬਰਦਸਤੀ ਤੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਜੇ ਕੱਲ ਨੂੰ ਕੋਈ ਗੱਲ ਹੋ ਤੇ ਕਹਣਾ ਮੇਰੇ ਕੋਲ ਐਵੇਂ ਸਾਈਨ ਕਰਾ ਦੇ ਸਨ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਤੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਨਹੀਂ ਅਵਲ ਕਲਮਾ ਤੈयब ला इलाहा इल्लल्लाह और मोहम्मद रसूलुल्लाह मुबारक हो लें जी आप
आपको कितनी देर से चाहते थे एक दूसरे को? 5 साल हो गए। आपके अबू अम्मी नहीं मानते थे, तो अगर अभी उनको पता चला तो फिर क्या होगा?
जंग बाहर होगी,
लेकिन आप एक दूसरे को सहारा दोगे?
We are ready to face any difficulty.
Odd as it sounds, what always impressed me most about Islamic marriage was the right to divorce. The Quran goes into great detail about divorce. In language that still astounds with its modernity, it acknowledges that marriages can break down and sets out principles to ensure women and children are treated fairly. Nothing in the principle of Islamic marriage is anti-female, but the practice is dominated by the weight of masculine tradition. Many Muslim men are known to use scripture to justify violence against women. The women in this safe house have suffered domestic violence, sexual abuse, and are victims of Pakistan's harsh zina laws, which as part of the strict Sharia law forbid all sex outside marriage. Many of these women's lives are under threat, simply choosing to marry whom they want, or for wanting a divorce from a violent husband. It took a strong woman to set up this shelter 2 years ago, the first one in Karachi. Majda Rizvi is Pakistan's first female High Court judge. She saw a desperate need for legal aid and support for these women.
Mainly it is the mindset which you can say the patriarchal society, because people think they don't accept women as their equal. When it comes to our rights, Islam is not there. When it comes to our duties, Islam is there. But of course, it takes time. People have changed, and hopefully they will further change. A better prospects for women, I think.
92 में मेरी शादी हुई और जब से वो कमाते ही नहीं.
I got married in 92, and since then my husband hasn't earned a penny. Actually, my marriage wasn't arranged, I was forced.
I have 5 children. One is studying the Quran, one is in school, and the other 3 are here. My husband didn't beat me, but he couldn't cope with the expense of 5 children and told me to go back to my parents.
I was sold for 20,000 rupees. They bought me forcibly. I wasn't happy about it, but they forced me. Then I had a son and a daughter, and my husband kept me locked up because he was afraid I would run away. Then I became pregnant again. He beat me up and then threw me out.
देखो पहले उसने तुम्हारी केयर नहीं की, तुमको गोलियां भी दी, तुमको पागल भी बनाया, सब किया. अब फर्ज करो तुम वापस जाओ और वो दोबारा तुमको मारे पीटे.
But what if it's put in writing?
लिखा पढ़ने से भी लोग लिख पढ़ के दे देते हैं, फिर भी वही करते हैं. तो क्या करो?
Yes, but my daughter's coming of age for marriage. My son is still in school. I can't ruin their lives.
In spite of this man beating her and not providing for her, she feels she has to go back to her husband because she's got this young daughter who is to be married, and that she's got smaller children who need education.
So does the Quran justify beating?
Men are the protectors and maintainers of women because God has given the one more strength than the other, and because they support them from their means. Therefore the righteous women are devoutly obedient and guard in the husband's absence what God would have them guard. As to those women on whose part ye fear disloyalty and ill conduct, admonish them first, next refuse to share their beds, and last beat them lightly. But if they return to obedience, seek not against the means of annoyance, for God is most high, great above you all. When I first read this, recently anyway, it seemed to kind of be the heart of the whole kind of feminist debate. You know, do women have to be obedient because men are inherently their masters? And in the context of punishment, rather than seeing it as men have the right to beat women because, you know, women obviously need a bit of a beating, the first thing you should be doing is trying to reason. It's completely turning on its head the attitudes to women of the time and talking about treating each other as equals in a way. And, you know, rather than beat up your wives, I think it's saying is beating should be the last thing on your mind.
Islam is anything but puritanical about the business of sex. Unlike Christianity, this is a religion that actually spells out the right to sexual fulfillment of both husband and wife. In Islam, sex is very much for pleasure as well as procreation, and there are verses which talk about the importance of mutual pleasure. In Surah 2, verse 187, permitted to you on the night of the fasts is the approach to your wives. They are your garments, and ye are their garments. There's also a verse which says that if men refuse to sleep with their wives for 4 months, she's entitled to have a divorce after that period if they're not reconciled. And there are hadiths as well which talk about the importance of a man pleasuring his wife. One of them says, when one of you copulates with his wife, let him not rush away from her, having attained his own climax, until she is satisfied. There's no sense that celibacy is a better state than marriage, quite the contrary, and there's certainly no Eve-like fall from grace. Islam not only allows for human desires, but also requires men to treat their wives fairly.
Polygamy is the issue in Islam which seems to cause the most confusion and the most trouble with interpretation. And certainly the Prophet Muhammad did marry many times, but people don't tend to know the context of his marriages. He first married at the age of 25. His wife Khadija, who was the first convert to Islam, was 40, and she proposed to him. And they were in fact monogamous for 25 years. Only after her death did the Prophet marry again, and most of those marriages are seen as being political ones. There was one point in his life when the Prophet wished to take a fifth wife, and the Quran had a limit of 4. And at that stage, the Prophet had a revelation which made a special dispensation that prophets were allowed up to 5. At that stage in his life, then he had 5 wives.
4 wives has been the limit ever since. Here in Nigeria, 42% of all married women are in polygamous relationships, not only within Muslim marriages, but as a result of Nigerian pre-Islamic custom. A man can have sex with 4 women within marriage, but if a woman sleeps with more than 1 man, that's adultery. But does Islam see that as a matter of private conscience, or a crime against God to be punished in the courts? In Nigeria, the stories of women sentenced to be stoned to death for adultery have shocked the world. The argument about enforcing Sharia, the Islamic legal code, goes on, but as yet no woman has been stoned to death. We're heading up to the far north of Nigeria, to the Muslim state of Sokoto. The signs boast that up here, the Sharia is the law. We've come in search of one of the women sentenced to death for adultery. Her name is Safia. After Safia's husband disappeared, she became pregnant by a man called Yakubo. Safia's terrible mistake was to tell her brother, a member of an extreme group of Islamists. Her appeal lawyer takes up the story.
Now, from what we were told, her brother Muhammadu belongs to a fundamentalist group called the Hizbah. And he felt he was doing the right thing by telling them that, oh, my sister Safia, my own sister, same mother, same father, is pregnant and she's not married. It's a problem, we have to do something about it. So they went and the Hizbahs thought, okay, they have to ask Safia to explain.
Under interrogation, Safia told her brother and his friend about Yakubo.
When they came to investigate me, they asked me whether I was pregnant or not. If I failed to tell them, they would take me to Sokoto and put pepper in my eyes. They harassed me and intimidated me. They confused me, and I was very surprised about everything.
She said, oh, it is one Yakubu that is responsible. And Yakubu was called to court, and from the record he denied. He said he doesn't even know what they are talking about, because he was forewarned that, if you accept it, you'll be held responsible for adultery and the punishment is stoned to death.
So Yakubo denied everything and was released. That seems perfectly fair to leading supporters of the Sharia.
In Sharia, if you swear, knowing that God knows whatever you have done, and you are willing to swear and risk the life everlasting in the hereafter, it's your bloody business. We leave you with God. The law will let him go, but she will have to be penalized.
Safia, meanwhile, was put under arrest and brought before the court.
They asked Safia, oh, Safia, you are pregnant without a husband. She said, yes. And they said, do you know that is adultery? She said, okay, if you say so. According to them, that was confession.
Since 1998, the penalty for a self-confessed adulterer in Sokoto has been death by stoning. The clearest example of how, for some very strict Muslims, like the General Secretary of the Supreme Sharia Council, religion and the rule of law are one and the same.
Sharia, to a Muslim who knows his religion, is a complete way of life. From cradle to grave, there is prescription for everything you do, how you do it. Islam has been a way of life until the advent of British colonialism. When they came, they deceived our people they did away with the criminal aspects of Sharia. Then Muslims suddenly realized, why should we accept their own laws? Why should they impose their own laws? We have ours, which we believe are superior. You understand?
So where does this apparently harsh and punitive Sharia law come from? Well, technically it has its source in the Quran, but there's much in modern Sharia law in Islamic states which is not to be found here. For example, there is no punishment of death by stoning for adultery, but there is a punishment of flogging with very strict conditions, and in fact the same punishment is given for falsely accusing someone of adultery. But Prophet Muhammad saw Islam as the logical conclusion to the Jewish faith, the teachings of the Torah and the teachings of Jesus. And death by stoning for adultery, for example, was in the Torah. And it seems that as different Islamic schools of thought and interpretation and schools of law have developed, these Jewish traditions have gradually become incorporated into Sharia law.
Everything about the criminal aspect of the Sharia is contained in the Bible. It says, whoever commits the act of homosexuality or sodomy should be punished. You find these condemnations in the law of Moses. So Islam, being part of the Abrahamic tradition, contains these laws. To a Muslim, the Quran is one complete divine injunction, which says if a person commits, for example, fornication or adultery, the law must apply its full course.
The trouble is, Sophia told us, in practice the whole system works against women and allows men off the hook.
There's never any evidence against men. It's really very difficult to prove anything against a man. But Allah, the evidence is really with God. You see, men really help each other, but it's Allah who knows the truth about everybody.
Safia didn't even understand the terminology in the court that condemned her to death. One thing saved her life on appeal. She'd got pregnant a few weeks before the Sharia officially became part of the criminal justice system. For Safia, it has been an ordeal, but for her lover Yakubo, there was justice of a kind.
After the sentence was passed, God intervened, and this man who violated Allah's trust and wronged me, 3 days later he was taken ill and died. The evil that he committed was turned back on him.
But the question here is not whether Safia was guilty of adultery, but whether the state has the right to criminalize a person's private life. Safia's lawyer says that for Muslims like her, as with modern Christians and Jews, the answer should be no.
My personal opinion is that to a very, very large extent, religion should be separated from state. That's how I feel, and that we should, as much as possible, also allow people to develop the value system and give them the opportunity to be as religious as possible, but not mix it up with politics.
Allah protects everybody from this kind of danger. Women should thank God and pray to Him to protect them from falling into this kind of situation. May Allah protect us and put us on the right path.
Safia was poor, uneducated, had no real idea of the crime she was supposed to have committed. But as I was finding out, she was typical of the kind of woman throughout the Muslim world who was victimized by Sharia law. As in northern Nigeria, Sharia law operates in Pakistan. There has never been any controversy about the imposition of Sharia law in personal and civil matters. It's the imposition of the criminal code that upset people, because although the country is 97% Muslim, Pakistan was not established as an Islamic republic.
It was set up to be a secular democracy in which not just Muslims, but women in general and other religious minorities should be able to enjoy freedoms. And what's happened over the years is that supposedly Islamic codes of moral behaviour have been forced onto a constitution that was never designed to take them.
They were imposed more than 20 years ago by the military dictator General Zia-ul-Haq. who seems to have picked out the nastiest interpretations that justify the ill treatment of women. They're known as the Hudud Ordinances, and they've been a curse on the women of Pakistan ever since. Here too, adultery is a criminal offence. The punishment is stoning to death if you're married, 100 lashes if you're single. But in practice, the death sentence has never been carried out. But many women are no longer prepared to accept this as the word of God. In Islam, there is no priesthood, only scholars, so anyone can interpret the Quran, which is what that brave judge, Majda Rizvi, is doing. She is challenging the mullahs on the Quran in support of the rights of women.
My concern mainly is most of these women who are victims of this law, I should say, are from the lower class, you know, they are uneducated women, and yet they are in jail. They haven't done anything wrong, and yet they are being abused. They haven't done anything wrong, and yet they are being raped and, misused and all. So I really feel bad, and my concern is that if we really want to have the Islamic laws, then they should be according to Islamic injunctions and not the law which is badly drafted, which is being abused, misused, misinterpreted, because this is not Islam.
So here in Pakistan, as in Egypt and Nigeria, educated women, politicians and lawyers are telling a new generation of young Muslim women to interpret the Quran for themselves.
And that's why I tell women, the younger, the women who are being educated, read Quran. Read with meanings. Try to understand. Try to interpret. Use your brains. And then we can fight with the mullahs. Because mullahs have no education at all. They have learned just a few things. And on that, the entire village is being governed by them. Because the villagers are mostly illiterate people, and whatever the mullah says, they accept it. So this is my concern.
Back in Britain, where we take education for granted, Muslim women are exploring ways of finding liberation by going back to the words of the Quran. The very fact that Britain is not a Muslim country means that they have had to decide on their own what makes a good Muslim, and many believe that's the best way to be.
Hey, Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to our Room's Courtship and Marriage event with live comedy from Jeff Mirza.
This is Clerkenwell in London, and a club full of young professionals. Single Muslim professionals attending a courtship and marriage evening.
Adnan, you're very attractive looking, if you don't mind me saying. I'm finding you strangely attractive. Do you want to come camping? No.
These are the British Muslims who don't make headlines. This could be any club in Notting Hill, but it's fruit juice, not alcohol behind the bar.
I like music. Do you like Bhangra music?
They are finding a way to live within two different cultures. One of them, Shagufta Yaqub, who edits a Muslim paper, Q News, liberated herself from having an arranged marriage by demonstrating to her family that the Quran says marriage should be freely undertaken and loving.
Islamically, I'm not compelled to marry any particular person. I have a right, in fact, if my consent is not part of the marriage contract, then the marriage contract's not valid. So I was finding out all these things and finding that Islam was so liberating for a woman. My parents initially, they just thought, she's sort of going against tradition, but when I actually put the Islamic arguments to them, they couldn't argue with that. Definitely my coming back to Islam had a big part to play in my newfound confidence in standing up for my rights.
I've recently got a mobile phone, on the Al-Qaeda network, You get a great reception in caves.
You'd never guess it from the fundamentalists or from the tabloids, but for these young Muslims, Britain is a surprisingly comfortable and inclusive place to live.
People often put Islam in opposition to being British or being American. I don't feel there's a contradiction there. Excessive patriotism, is questionable, but loyalty to the land that you live in is actually very Islamic, an Islamic idea. Islam does come first. You know, I'll be Muslim whether I'm in Britain or America or Pakistan or Egypt or wherever I go, I'll be a Muslim. But that doesn't mean that, you know, I'm disloyal to this country.
It was 55 years ago, you know. The British, they left Pakistan. They said, okay, we are leaving. It is your country now. And what did they say? They said, no, we are coming with you.
How does being a Muslim in Britain feel? You know, how do you think of yourself? How does it affect the way you live and what you do?
I think it's one of the best places in the world you can be a Muslim, because there's that freedom to express yourself, which you don't necessarily have. Certainly minorities and even Muslim countries will tell you they don't have that kind of freedom, and also it's not something that's being imposed upon you. So a lot of young British Muslims, you know, they choose to be Muslim.
But right now I think asylum seekers are getting a hard time. Have we got any asylum seekers in tonight? Have you noticed how many Australians are coming over to this country? They're taking our jobs. They are taking our women. 2 Australians have moved in next door to me. They have brought down the price of my house. And where I live, that's not easy. I knocked on the door.
The issue isn't so much, you know, it's Islam versus sort of modern Western modes of behaviour, but it's the lack of sort of, in a sense, spirituality of deeply held religion in a country like Britain.
The more role models young British Muslims have, the more positive images they see, the more sort of young progressive Islam, British Islam that they see, the more likely they are to aspire to that and actually feel that, hang on, we do have something here, we can work towards something. And I think many of the problems we face as Muslims in this society are not specifically Muslim or Islamic issues. They're just a general, you know, people who are people of faith who are still holding on to, you know, deeply spiritual ideas.
Leaving the club, I was struck by how successfully these Muslims have combined their faith with their secular principles. When I began my exploration of the lives of women in Islam, I couldn't understand why so many younger than me were turning to the veil, why public identification as a Muslim was so significant. Having travelled across 3 continents, what I now understand is that the harsh simplicity of fundamentalism is very often a reaction against the imposition of Western culture. That the old symbols and practices provide self-respect and identity. But what I didn't expect, and what's given me real hope, is the discovery that across the Islamic world, it is modern, free-thinking women who are going back to the Quran to challenge the mullahs and are seeking an interpretation of Islam that works for women in the 21st century. I am confident that they will find it. Inshallah.